In the heart of Europe stood a wall that split one city in two, east and west, hope and fear. Between 1961 and 1989, Berlin became the stage for one of history's most powerful human dramas. This is what life was really like behind the wall, Berlin. Once the beating heart of Europe, a city of music, art, and ideas. But after the Second World War, it became something else entirely, a symbol of division, ideology, and human endurance. In 1945, when the guns fell silent and the smoke lifted from the ruins, Berlin lay in ashes, broken, scarred, and occupied. The Allies carved Germany into four zones, each controlled by a victorious power, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. And though Berlin lay deep inside the Soviet zone, it too was divided into four parts. For a while, the uneasy alliance held, but it wouldn't last. By the late 1940s, tension crackled across Europe. The Cold War had begun, a silent conflict fought with propaganda, politics, and fear. The West spoke of freedom and democracy. The East spoke of equality and protection. And caught between these worlds was Berlin, a small island of hope, surrounded by walls of suspicion. People began to flee from east to west. Teachers, doctors, engineers, entire families slipped through the cracks of control, seeking a better life beyond the Soviet border. By 1961, more than 2 million had escaped through Berlin. It was a humiliation the East could no longer bear. And then, one August night, everything changed. Under the cover of darkness on August 13, 1961, soldiers and workers began sealing the border, barbed wire first, then concrete. Streets were torn apart, railways cut, families divided. Overnight, the city of Berlin became two worlds, one free, one locked in. The Berlin Wall had been born. At first, it was a crude barrier, a few fences and blocks of concrete. But as the years passed, it evolved into a fortress, 12 feet high, 100 miles long, lined with guard towers, floodlights, and a deadly death strip, where anyone who tried to cross could be shot on sight. More than 140 people would die attempting to escape. Thousands were captured, imprisoned, or disappeared into the shadows of the Stasi, East Germany's secret police. And yet, even within those walls, life went on. In East Berlin, children still played in courtyards, families gathered for dinners, musicians composed songs in secret, artists painted their truth behind closed doors, teachers whispered forbidden ideas to students they trusted. It was a life of quiet rebellion, lived between fear and hope. On the western side, life felt freer, but not without guilt. Many Berliners could see the wall from their windows, a constant reminder that part of their city and part of their people was trapped just meters away. Every celebration was shadowed by separation. Every night, floodlights from the wall cut across the skyline like scars. Still, hope refused to die. Smugglers built tunnels beneath the streets. Pilots flew daring escapes. Some crossed the wall in hot air balloons, others in hidden compartments of cars. Each successful escape was a small victory for the human spirit, a reminder that no wall could cage the will to be free. And as the decades passed, the world began to change. The Soviet Union weakened, the voices for freedom grew louder, and even those inside the East began to believe that the impossible could happen. Then came November 9, 1989, the night history took a deep breath. Confusion spread through the ranks, and in a moment that no one planned, the gates were opened. People poured through the checkpoints, laughing, crying, breaking pieces of the wall with hammers and hands. East met West, and Berlin, after 28 long years, was one again. But behind that moment of joy were millions of untold stories, stories of love, loss, courage, and quiet defiance. Stories of the people who lived behind the wall, who endured and resisted, who never gave up their humanity even when the world was divided in two. These are the stories time almost forgot. The lost stories of Berlin. Behind the concrete and barbed wire of the Berlin Wall lived millions of people whose voices were buried beneath propaganda and politics. This is their story, not of governments, but of human beings who refused to be forgotten. Life in the shadow of the wall in East Berlin every morning began the same. Loudspeakers echoed the slogans of socialism. Children saluted the flag of the German Democratic Republic, and the smell of coal smoke filled the narrow streets. But beneath that routine lay a quiet tension, a feeling that freedom existed just beyond sight. Families who once lived across the street from one another were suddenly separated by concrete. Mothers waved to sons through barbed wire. Lovers left standing on opposite sides of a wall that neither of them had built. Some people accepted it, others pretended to, but deep down, everyone knew this was not how life was meant to be. Fear and control, the East German secret police, the Stasi, watched everything. A friend could be an informant, a neighbor could be listening. One careless sentence could mean prison, interrogation, or worse. People learned to whisper, to hide their thoughts, to smile when they were expected to, and never ask too many questions. And yet, even in fear, there were sparks of defiance. Underground writers circulated banned books, musicians played Western rock in basements, teachers told students about freedom in hushed tones. Freedom was an idea fragile, dangerous, and unstoppable. The human cost among the countless who suffered was a young man named Peter Fechter, just 18 years old. On August 17, 1962, Peter and a friend tried to escape across the wall near Checkpoint Charlie. His friend made it. Peter didn't. He was shot and left to bleed out in plain view of both sides for nearly an hour. Neither East nor West dared to help. Peter's death sent shockwaves through Berlin. It was a moment that revealed the full cruelty of the wall, and the world could no longer look away. But his story was just one among thousands. Some were captured, some disappeared, some made it across but carried the scars forever. Hope beneath the ground, desperation breeds creativity. Beneath Berlin, freedom took the form of tunnels. Ordinary people, students, engineers, construction workers dug their way under the wall, often with nothing but shovels, buckets, and courage. Some tunnels succeeded, many failed, but each one was an act of rebellion against the idea that human beings could be caged. One of the most famous, Tunnel 57, led 57 East Berliners to freedom in 1964. It wasn't built by governments or soldiers, but by friends who simply refused to leave others behind. Voices of resilience. Not everyone chose escape. Many stayed to survive, to protect their families, or to quietly resist. In East Berlin, artists found subtle ways to speak the truth. Painters used gray tones to show despair. Writers used metaphors to criticize the regime. And ordinary citizens built communities of strength and solidarity, whisper networks that kept hope alive in the darkest times. Even children learned to dream differently. Some said, "One day we'll walk through that wall." And though adults often smiled sadly at those words, the children were right. The turning point by the late 1980s, change was in the air. Across Eastern Europe, people were rising up in Poland, in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia. The Iron Curtain was beginning to crack. In East Germany, protests grew. The chants became louder. Wir sind das Volk. We are the people. The government tried to silence them, but the tide had already turned. On November 9, 1989, a confused press conference led to an unexpected announcement. The borders were open. Within hours, thousands rushed to the wall. Guards overwhelmed, unprepared, stepped aside, hammers hit concrete, families embraced, strangers wept in each other's arms. The wall that had divided a city for 28 years finally fell not through war, but through the unstoppable power of ordinary people demanding to be free. The legacy today, only fragments of the Berlin Wall remain reminders of a time when freedom was a luxury. But the true story isn't written in the stones. It lives in the people, those who endured, those who resisted, and those who never stopped believing that one day the wall would fall. Their courage reminds us that history isn't just shaped by leaders and armies, it's written by the human heart. And as long as walls rise, whether of concrete, ideology, or fear, the stories of Berlin will whisper to us. By the late 1980s, the world was changing faster than anyone could control. Communism was weakening across Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union, once a giant, was collapsing under its own weight. The people of East Germany had grown tired of fear, tired of being told what to think, where to work, and how to live. The streets of Leipzig, Dresden, and Berlin began to fill with quiet defiance. At first, it was only a handful church gatherings, small meetings, whispers of reform, but whispers grew into voices, and voices into a roar. Every Monday, thousands marched with candles in their hands and courage in their hearts, chanting words that no dictator can silence. Wir sind das Volk. We are the people. They weren't armed. They weren't soldiers. They were teachers, nurses, students, factory workers, ordinary citizens demanding something extraordinary, freedom. The government tried to crush the protests with intimidation and arrests, but the tide was unstoppable. The soldiers who once enforced fear now hesitated. Many began to question the orders they were given. The wall of silence inside the hearts of East Germans was crumbling long before the concrete wall itself did. Then came November 9, 1989, a night born from confusion and destiny. A senior East German official, Gunther Schabowski, was handed a note at a press conference. It contained new travel regulations meant to ease pressure on the regime. But he hadn't been fully briefed. When asked when these new travel freedoms would take effect, Schabowski, uncertain, glanced at his papers and said the words that would change history, "As far as I know." Effective immediately, without delay. The world froze. Within minutes, the news spread like wildfire across East Berlin. People ran to the checkpoints, clutching passports and hope. Guards at the border were confused. They had received no orders. The crowds grew larger, the chants louder. "Open the gate! Open the gate!" At Bornholmer-Strabe checkpoint, one commander made a choice that would echo through history. Outnumbered and overwhelmed, he lifted the barrier. No one stopped him. No one fired, and then it happened. Thousands poured across the border, laughing, crying, embracing strangers. People climbed the wall, danced on top of it, kissed the concrete that had once divided them. Champagne bottles popped, music played, and tears fell freely as East and West Berliners stood together under the same cold November by the late 1980s. The world was changing faster than anyone could control. Communism was weakening across Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union, once a giant, was collapsing under its own weight. The people of East Germany had grown tired of fear, tired of being told what to think, where to work, and how to live. The streets of Leipzig, Dresden, and Berlin began to fill with quiet defiance. At first, it was only a handful church gatherings, small meetings, whispers of reform, but whispers grew into voices, and voices into a roar. Every Monday, thousands marched with candles in their hands and courage in their hearts, chanting words that no dictator can silence. Wir sind das Volk. We are the people. They weren't armed. They weren't soldiers. They were teachers, nurses, students, factory workers, ordinary citizens demanding something extraordinary, freedom. The government tried to crush the protests with intimidation and arrests, but the tide was unstoppable. The soldiers who once enforced fear now hesitated. Many began to question the orders they were given. The wall of silence inside the hearts of East Germans was crumbling long before the concrete wall itself did. Then came November 9, 1989, a night born from confusion and destiny. A senior East German official, Gunther Schabowski, was handed a note at a press conference. It contained new travel regulations meant to ease pressure on the regime. But he hadn't been fully briefed. When asked when these new travel freedoms would take effect, Schabowski, uncertain, glanced at his papers and said the words that would change history. As far as I know, effective immediately, without delay. The world froze. Within minutes, the news spread like wildfire across East Berlin. People ran to the checkpoints, clutching passports and hope. Guards at the border were confused. They had received no orders. The crowds grew larger, the chants louder, "Open the gate, open the gate." At Bornholmer Strabe checkpoint, one commander made a choice that would echo through history. Outnumbered and overwhelmed, he lifted the barrier. No one stopped him, no one fired, and then it happened. Thousands poured across the border, laughing, crying, embracing strangers. People climbed the wall, danced on top of it, kissed the concrete that had once divided them. Champagne bottles popped, music played, and tears fell freely as East and West Berliners stood together under the same cold November, the night the Berlin Wall fell. The world witnessed more than the end of a barrier. It witnessed the triumph of the human spirit. What began as whispers in the dark became a chorus of freedom that no army, no ideology, no government could silence. For 28 years, concrete and steel tried to divide a people, but they never divided their hope. Behind those walls were hearts that refused to surrender. Mothers who whispered forbidden lullabies, artists who painted truth behind closed doors, children who dreamed of walking into a world they had never seen. When the wall fell, those dreams walked out of the shadows. Berlin became one city again, but its story belongs to all of humanity, because the wall was never just in Berlin. It stood and still stands wherever fear tries to separate us from one another, wherever truth is silenced, wherever people are told what they can or cannot be. Every generation faces its own walls, some made of concrete, others of prejudice, ignorance, or hate. But the lesson of Berlin is eternal. No wall lasts forever. Freedom is not given, it is claimed, and the courage to claim it often begins quietly in ordinary hearts under extraordinary pressure. Those who lived behind the wall proved something powerful, that the strength of a people united by hope is greater than any regime built on fear. They remind us that even when the night is longest, dawn is always waiting, and the human spirit always finds a way to rise. So when we look at the broken pieces of the Berlin Wall, today scattered across museums and streets, we are not looking at ruins. We are looking at reminders, reminders of what we can endure, reminders of what we can overcome, reminders that freedom, once awakened, never sleeps again. And that is the legacy of Berlin, a city once divided, now standing as a monument to unity, courage, and the unbreakable will of the human heart, because walls fall, but humanity rises.